There we go. So we get to talk about scandals on State Street. It only took 5 times. I haven't been drinking since 5 o'clock this afternoon. So that's part of the perks of being a lecturer. So we get to talk about the scandals of State Street. And of course, Chicago does not have royalty, but we did have the merchant prince of State Street, which was, let's see if this works. No, it did not. Marshall Field and his wife, Nanny Douglas Scott. This was a marriage built on infatuation. So this is when a farm boy turned department store owner would meet a socialite. Marshall Field, his family came over on the Mayflower, and if somebody told me, oh, my ancestors came on the Mayflower, I would assume you were very wealthy. You lived in a house with wood-paneled walls and leather-backed chairs. You basically lived in Ralph Lauren. But Marshall Field grew up very, very poor in Massachusetts. He did not even have gloves growing up. He remembers many cold winters in Massachusetts without gloves. When he came to Chicago, because I'm not going to give you the entire history of Marshall Field because we're going to be here a really long time, he would eventually meet Nanny Douglas Scott at a party. She was 23, he was 28. She was sophisticated and urbane. She was from Ohio, so they're very sophisticated and urbane there. And he was a shy 28-year-old. They met at a party and they felt sparks. They chatted all night and he's like, can I see you again? And unfortunately, I have to go back to Ohio tomorrow. Oh, well, can I see you off? Sure. So in her mind, she's thinking, the courting process has begun. This guy has a lot of money. I'm also from deep pockets too. It's meant to be. So that when they get to the train station, I'm sure she says a very cliche, I'll write to you, and she boards the train. And in something like out of a Hallmark movie, that train slowly starts chugging away, and Marshall starts running. He runs, boards that moving train, finds Nanny, who's at this point surrounded by strangers getting seated, and he's like, if I let you go, it's going to be the biggest mistake of my life. Will you marry me? And without a second of hesitation, she says, yes. Yes, I will. She's going to be the Mrs. Marshall Field. And in the true Marshall Field fashion, the minute that train got to the next station, he got off. It's a work day. He's got work to do. But I'm sure he did it with a big smile on his face. He's going to marry the woman of his dreams. A very wise woman by the name of Jessica Fletcher once said, flowers that bloom too early are fair game to a late frost. Meaning what we think is love is really just infatuation. And our current day and age, if you get into a marriage based on infatuation, you get a divorce. No one's going to bat an eye. Or if you're religious, you can do an annulment. But during the Victorian era, divorce is almost unheard of. A man could divorce a woman if she abandons him. If he comes home from work one day and she's gone, I think she's gone for good. Okay, let's give it some time. Yeah, she's gone. We can get divorced. A woman could divorce her husband for abandonment, also for cruelty. Take cruelty with several heaping tablespoons of salt, because a man could do whatever he wanted to a woman. If he wants to beat her, that's fine. The police aren't going to get involved. That's domestic. If she tries to reach out help from other male family members, it's really not my place to say that. What are you doing wrong? If she thinks she's going to get support from women, they're going to be the biggest supporters of men. Those defend them like, oh, my husband's the same way too. Did you burn the roast? Where the kid's acting up, like, just smile. You have to make this work. So women really had no escape from a marriage. So on the outward experience, Marshall Field and his wife were this power couple. They lived in the first fully electric mansion in Chicago. He was a successful department store owner. She was a gracious mother. They lived in a beautiful home, threw amazing parties. Every Chicago couple wanted to be them. Behind that, it was all a facade. It was a marriage where they hated each other. They were stuck together. They couldn't leave. And they would eventually, some of them would get substance abuse issues. It was not a very happy marriage. And as they got married, they came to realize it's really based because they're not very compatible. They're very different people. Nanny, being from very sophisticated Ironton, Ohio, which I'd never heard of until I actually did this lecture, was this little town on the Ohio River. Like the name implies, it was the center of iron production. Her family was heavily involved in the iron production business, and they were very wealthy for it. So she went to school in quaint little college town. She was educated. Marshall was very poor. He grew up very hardscrabble, and he liked to work. That would create a big difference in the way they wanted to live their lives. Nanny would consider herself a bit of bohemian, despite missing two very important factors. She was not artistic at all, But if you ever been to an apple orchard during the fall time and run into a girl named Michaela in a wide brim hat who's on Instagram, she's not artistic either. She works in marketing. And she also liked to consider herself a bohemian. And bohemians, we're not talking about people from the modern day Czech Republic, the artsy kind. She was not artsy and she was not poor. But she liked to put on this guise of being, I'm an artistic person. She also dressed very scandalous for Chicagoans. This would be like mild by our typical standards, but she liked to wear tea gowns. Tea gowns were more free-flowing. For very conservative Chicago, that's like walking around in a negligee. Victorian women in Chicago still were wearing bustles and very tight corsets, and she was basically walking around in pajamas. She also loved to host parties, and she would invite artists as guests. If you were a very wealthy Chicagoan and you wanted to show off, like, why are you going to see a famous singer at the Auditorium Theater? I'm going to have them in my ballroom today. And they would come to your house. They would enter through the side door. They are not guests. They're your employee for the evening. So they would entertain. And as soon as they were done entertaining, your party would go to the dining room and have dinner. And they would have dinner sent to their room. They were not equal to you. They were your employees for the evening. She liked to have them at parties. And you would go to her parties and you would see a dapper gentleman or an attractive woman and you would shake hands. And it's like, what do you do? Oh, I'm an artist. You just shook hands with an artist. How disgusting is that? She was very more broad-minded. He liked to be more conservative. And as their marriage went on, it created a rift. And he would come to realize she's really not the person who's filling his heart. There was someone else who was taking that spot. They were elegant by our standards, a classical beauty. And they were TICC thick. I mean, let alone their columns weighed several tons. His true love, you can still find it today at 111 North State Street. It was his store. That was his refuge from this toxic marriage, was going to his store. And for a while, that was his island of solitude until she started showing up at the store. And when she was having a bad day, Nanny would be like, take me to the store. She would walk in very casually, greet people, and the minute she got into Marshall's office, she would slam the door and start screeching and yelling. And Marshall, who loves to have this cool facade, would have an office full of people outside hearing this all. It was as if she dragged him to a hell on earth. So why does she do this, though? So there's a couple theories. One was that she was just lonely. He really was a workaholic, and he was spending more time in the Loop instead of visiting her Loop, if you know what I mean. Another theory is she was a drug addict. Was she going up to an alley and buying marijuana or going to the North Shore to buy booger sugar? She was probably on the Victorians' favorite drug of opium. She probably went into a doctor's office, oh, like, you're stressed, you're a woman, you're clearly stressed, you should try opium. A lot of Victorian medicine was quackery. It was snake oil, and a lot of it that would cure stuff would make you even sicker. A lot of times the disease was better than the cure. But opium was like this cure. You would feel so much better after taking it. And, you would feel so good until you crash. And even today we see people that have opioid addictions have mood swings and angry outbursts and irritability. All these things that Nanny would have. Eventually they realized we can't live together. Divorce is out of the question. So the most practical thing to do, she left for France. So, and saved face for everyone because they're like, you know what, Marshall's such a good husband. She's got wanderlust, and he's letting her go abroad and live in Nice, France, and he's working and making the money. All husbands should be like that. Technically, it's a really good gig. I would love if someone was paying all my bills and let me live abroad. I could be in a sham marriage. That's fine. Eventually, though, she would die in France under mysterious circumstances. They would say abdominal swelling. Let's see if I can move this right. No, I can't. So she died in Nice, and Marshall Field, I'm sure, thought that was nice because he did not like her anymore. And at this point, he could gravitate towards a woman that he started becoming friends with and eventually would become his future wife, Miss Delia Canton. She was a close family friend. She was a number of years his junior, but she had a soft spot for him. It wasn't like hot passion and romance. He was kind of awkward. We think of Marshall Field being this man in a nice tailored suit. He was a farmer in a suit. He did not know the nuances of being wealthy. He was new money. And people like Arthur Canton, Delia Canton's husband, was old money, quote unquote. There was only one generation of money. So like they're now Chicago old money. And he was a sportsman who hanged around clubs and smoked cigars and raced horses. And Marshall Field really disliked working. So one time at a party at Delia's house, everyone's going around giving a toast and giving a speech, and Marshall didn't know what the hell to do. So she hopped in and was like, oh, Marshall was just going to tell us about his great sale at his store. That's very considerate, Marshall. So polite society is like, there's something going on between Marshall and Delia. Eventually, when Arthur died, we heard two different stories. The newspapers in Chicago said he died suddenly and unexpectedly. Arthur was from a little town called Ottawa, Illinois, by Starved Rock. That's their native son. They were printing a very different story. Their biggest sponsor must have been Lipton Tea because they were spilling the tea and it was scalding. They said that he killed himself. He was a laughingstock. Everyone knew him and Marshall Field and Delia were having an affair. It was going on for years. There were rumors that there were tunnels connecting their mansions. There weren't. But Chicagoans love the idea of tunnels everywhere. But they were Marshall Field was frangoing his wife, and he could not deal with it anymore, and he killed himself. Even when Marshall Field's wife was still alive in France, Nanny was dipping her toes into the Mediterranean while Marshall was here in Chicago dipping his toes into a lake known as Delia. So they were doing it for quite some time, but with him dead, they can finally pursue their relationship. They were eventually married. Let's hop down. In 1905, so here's a happy couple. That picture's horrible of her. This is what she actually looked like. She was very pretty. The newspaper, because this was a newspaper at the time, would describe her beauty as she wasn't too fat and she wasn't too thin. She was just right. So basically she was like porridge in the Goldilocks now. But she was very, very pretty and she was smart. And they only got to be married for about 5 months. Marshall Field would die. There would be a family death in the family that would really affect him greatly. But when he got married, Delia was 46, Marshall was 70, and I said it before and I said it again, just because there's snow on the roof does not mean there's no fire in the furnace, because Marshall was still getting it. If only for 5 months, but he was still getting it. So now that Delia is happy widow again, she stayed around in Chicago for a little while, but then she wanted to go to a more wholesome city. So she would eventually go to Washington, D.C., the most wholesome city we got. This is a photo of her later on in life. She is showing some side boob, which is very scandalous. And she would buy a ginormous mansion called the Pink Palace, which sounds like a spinoff of the Golden Girls. And she would be hostess to foreign dignitary government officials. And did she ever marry again? No. But does she have affairs? We don't know. She was a classy lady towards the end. But I can guarantee you, by her showing some side boob and still looking good in old age during her Guild era, I can almost guarantee you she probably would have lured some government official to her bedroom or some young attaché that was down for no denture adventure, but she was still getting at her old age too. So she did live a long and happy life. The same could not be said about Marshall Field's children. And if you know Chicago history, like, oh, I know about Marshall Field's son. There's some scandal about him. But his daughter, Ethel, which surprisingly with a name like Ethel would be scandalous, she was even worse. So we get to talk about Ethel Field. She was a socialite and a sneaky link. She was Marshall Field's unruly daughter. And as much as Marshall Field and his wife didn't get along, they really did love their children, and they can only love them the best way they could. They spoiled them. So she was born 1873, the only daughter. She got whatever she wanted. She was always spoiled, while her father always away and her mother basically absent too. She was given lots and lots of gifts. So in her mind, gifts are love. Like her mother, she also liked the arts. She would marry into an artistic supporting family. She would marry into the family of Arthur Maggie Tree. If you've ever been by the Bally Studio or Casino, Tree Studios It was founded by the Tree family. They weren't artistic at all, but they realized, I like art and I feel like I support artists, so let me build housing and studios for them. This will remain until about the 1960s, so they were very dedicated in the art scene. Her and Arthur would meet fox hunting like most people meet their future husbands in the United Kingdom. They were married here in Chicago, but they got such a good taste of the UK, so they eventually ended up moving there. And as one does, they built a very large English estate, as one does with, the money they have. And their marriage actually started off for a rocky start. Both their children died in infancy. They would have one child named Ronald. And there was a little bit of a high in that marriage, like, okay, and then it would quickly fade. Ethel didn't like being a mom. For someone who really did not have a mom growing up, it's not surprising, because for her it was very tedious and boring. Like, who would want to spend all their time in a multi-room English mansion when you could be gambling in the south of France? Just like her mom. She also loved to fox hunt. And not only did she like to hunt for foxes, she also loved to hunt for men. Probably because how rocky her marriage was, she eventually fell into the arms of David Beatty. He was a decorated British Army soldier. He was in a lot of military conflicts from like the Sudan to the Boxer Rebellion. He was everywhere. And he was so enchanted by this very wealthy and very beautiful heiress. And he put his whole entire career online, because this is Victorian England. If you have an affair, it's like all your amazing military things out the door. It's like you're a horrible person. But they decided to have an affair. In 1901, after about 2 years of British-style shagging, she decided to leave her husband. She left her husband, basically the same Victorian version of like how we send like a text message if you want to break up. She sent him a letter, like, I am leaving you and I don't want to give any more details. He did not fight the divorce. I'm sure he was excited to get rid of her. 10 days after the divorce was finalized, she married David Beatty. No family was in the wedding. Marshall Field was not a fan of him. He's like, oh yeah, you're a military person, but she has no more dowry and you don't make any money. But eventually he warmed up to him. David's father did not approve of the marriage at first, because he's like, I can do math. There's no way in hell someone's going to marry someone after 10 days of knowing them. People are going to know you were having an affair. And he was a good Christian man. So he wasn't that Christian because he also went to the dark arts and asked a psychic if the marriage was going to be a good marriage. And the psychic said yes. That crystal ball really must have been dirty, because this marriage was not happy whatsoever. This marriage produced 2 children. I'm not going to go too much in detail on the first child. His name was David, but he did get married 4 times. So clearly, if you don't do it once the first time, just keep trying again. But Ethel was a bad mother, even with this family. She abandoned her old son from the previous marriage to go start a relationship with David. She really didn't want a mother, and she really wasn't even a good wife. It was more about the conquest, because the minute that she got married, she was on the prowl again. Her poor son, Peter, would pay for her scandalous actions. They would grow up in a household there was no love, not between the parents or the children. She would be gone half the time. But to the British public, it was a glorious couple. A decorated war veteran. She was a rich socialite. They had this ginormous mansion. They entertained the monarchs. They're like, what a great family. And it was even worse in the family that Ethel grew up with, her parents, except there was a very infectious disease now in this line. This sham marriage would last until about 1932, when Ethel passed away in her sleep. She wasn't even 60 yet. People blame because she loved to drink, as I sip my next sip. But she was quite a lush. The chronic illness that I had to rehearse like 9 times. I'm like, I'm going to mess this up. Her son Peter was born with ophthalmia neonatorum, and you get it in the birth canal from syphilis or gonorrhea. So she had something. David Beatty did not have something. And it was well accepted that Peter was not actually David's son. But his family always treated him like they were family, partly because they loved him, partly to avoid the scandal. He would follow in the footsteps of his father figure, David. He would be in the military. The British press would dub him one of the most eligible bachelors. He was tall, dark, and handsome. He loved to ride horses, but his life was always shadowed by poor vision because of this disease he had. In October 26, 1949, he was at the Ritz-Carlton in London. At this point, he can only get around with the help of his valet. He told his valet, like, oh, I'm meeting friends on the 6th floor if you could take me up there. Of course. His valet noticed he was kind of odd this week, but, you know, maybe he's in a moody day. He took him to the 6th floor. There's no one there. And he's like, oh, they must be running late. You can leave me here. I'll see you tomorrow. This will be the last time his valet ever saw him alive. He would find his way to a window and jump. Earlier that week, he discovered that he would be going blind and he would never see again. So between the two options, he ended up ending his life. And all this was because his mother had an affair. And it really didn't get better even for Marshall Field's son, the boy that was supposed to be king. Marshall Field Jr. was born in 1868. His father grew up with nothing. His son would have everything. From a very early age, it was realized he was going to eventually own this department store. In 1890, he married, you can drink, I forgot to do it. He married very attractive Albertine Huck. And just a social commentary, this shows how much Victorian society in Chicago had progressed. Albertine Huck's father was a German immigrant, and he was Catholic. If this marriage happened back when Marshall Field got married in the 1850s and 1840s, it wouldn't have been a thing. Protestants did not marry into German Catholic immigrants or even any immigrants that were Catholic. They weren't worried. Even if they had money, it's like, we don't want their money. But now we have progressed where it's like, you can marry a good Catholic brewer's daughter. And on the appearance, it was a very happy marriage. She was very beautiful. She was a good mother. They lived in a beautiful mansion right down the street from Marshall Field Sr. And then tragedy struck. On November 27, 1905, Marshall Field Jr. accidentally shot himself in his home. The only people at home were the butler and the nanny who heard the shot. They quickly raced him to Mercy Hospital on the south side because the doctors believed that something could still be done. He ended up dying. Marshall Field would release a press release about the horrible accidental death of his son. But many people don't believe that actually happened because there is a scandalous story too. Some people say, no, he was not actually shot on Prairie Avenue. He was shot in the house of ill repute at the famous Everly Club in Chicago. He was known to frequent there like most wealthy Victorian men. They knew him by name. They had a special room for him. It was confessed many years, about 20 years after his death, that a prostitute shot him by the name of Vera Scott. She went by the name of Vera Leroy because anything French sounds scandalous and whorish. So she says that he was at the Everly Club on that evening, not only enjoying her company, but also the company of another girl named Alice. And he may have been drunk because they said a lot of wine was involved. And Vera got upset and she grabbed his gun either in play or to shoot him, but she shot. And he went down, and to avoid scandal at the Everly Club, because you don't want to be like, we shoot our customers, and to avoid scandal at Marshall Field, like, get him out of here, bring him home. Apparently, according to Vera, Marshall Field Sr. came the next day and offered her $250,000 in today's money to get out of town. We can't handle the scandal. And when the newspapers asked, like, why did Chicago newspapers report this? Well, Marshall Field had his thumb on the newspaper. You could not print anything Marshall Field did not want in the newspaper. So do we really know how he died? It's up to you. It's kind of hard to, he shot himself through the liver. It's kind of hard to shoot yourself through the liver. The way if you're handling a rifle or a gun, it's more likely he did kill himself, but this is a Victorian society. Lower class men went to whorehouses, not dignified men like Marshall Field's son, especially not in the company of two women at the same time. So clearly he was getting it too. But Marshall Field's family in general, they had an immense amount of money, influence over Chicago. But it couldn't erase all the suffering that bad actions would cause, all the tears, all the heartache, and all of it stems from one night when a 23-year-old and a 28-year-old met and let flowers bloom way too quickly. But not all relationships on State Street are bad. We have some happy ones too. And some of them were kind of unconventional. And now we basically get to talk about a Cinderella story. And Molly Alpener, who would eventually become Molly Netcher. Molly grew up on the west side of Chicago in the Jewish tenement districts. And when she got a job at the Boston store, it was such a big deal for her family. Immigrant girls who were living in tenements generally worked in sweatshops. They would work as seamstresses. They would make hats. To get a child who's working in a white-collar job, like as a shop girl, you would like be bragging to all your tenement neighbors, like, yeah, she rides a CTA to work. She is not going home and working in a sweatshop. And she was very ambitious. Many girls would just be happy being a shop girl, because if you're a shop girl, you're probably going to meet a nice boy who's going to be like a clerk, and you're not going to, when you get married, you're not going to live in the tenement. You may live in a Greystone, you may live in a single family home, but you're going to have such a better life. But she liked to work, and she worked hard. She worked her tuchus off. Eventually, she would become in charge of the shop girls, so she'd become manager. But she's like, I'm going to keep working. Eventually, she became the company's undergarments buyer, so she was buying the underwear. But she's like, I'm going to keep working. I have potential. I'm going to keep working. I'm going to get to the top. Till eventually, she got on top of her boss. She would end up marrying her boss. And this raised some eyebrows. So for Victorian wealthy men to take a lower class woman as a mistress, that was pretty common, and everybody wanted the situation. The man was getting gratification, the mistress was getting financial stability, and a lot of times the wife didn't care, because this is the Victorian era. Sexual gratification for women didn't exist. She just basically laid back, closed her eyes, and thought of England, because it was not about her. So she's like, if somebody else wants to do it for me, fine. If I want to have an orgasm, I'm just going to go to the doctor because I have hysteria. But to marry one, though, it raised some eyebrows. But in reality, they really weren't that different. He was not for money. He's not even from Chicago, like most people who made waves in Chicago. Came from out east. He's from the Queen City of New York State, Buffalo. He came here for economic opportunities he could not find in Buffalo. And he would eventually meet Molly, who is basically his female counterpart, who could basically run the store in his absence. And their marriage was a very happy one. They would be married till about 1904 after they got married in 1891. He died of appendicitis. And at this point in history, a lot of people were like, okay, we have a whole board. They're going to pick a man to run this company. And Molly's like, no, this is now my store. And the board went along like, she did work her way from the bottom to the top. And this was just, at this point, a very glorified dry goods store. This was not a major department store. Eventually, the store would be number 2 in the city. It would encompass about a block of the city. At its peak, have 4,000 employees. It even gave Marshall Fields a run for this money. I would constantly be number 2, but every year was getting closer to toppling Marshall Fields of being the number 1 store. There was even a jingle at the time that wasn't an official Marshall Fields jingle, but I'm sure it tickled his fancy because it threw some major shade. Girls that like to wear high heels, they trade down at Marshall Fields. Girls that have to scrub the floor, they shop at the Boston store. So Marshall Fields loved to throw shade, and this woman was like basically the thorn in his ass because she was getting closer and closer. And many people were like, the woman can't run a store. She would remarry in 1913 to a man named Saul, and people were like, okay, now a man's going to take over again. At 9:45 every workday, she would get chauffeured and dropped off in front of the store with Saul, her husband. She would walk to her office and start crunching numbers, and he would go to his office and he would play with stamps and coins. He was basically old eye candy, so he was like Werther's original. He was just there for show. She still ran the show. During the 1920s, the Boston store would continue to grow as this major store. 1930s, not so much. Many people like to think like if something's not broken, don't fix it. She tried following this model while other stores were expanding, opening up different branches, offering credit. She's like, I do not want to offer credit. Because as today, hoes are shady. And she's like, I don't trust people. So her store became very dated. It would say that it had a quaint Victorian mustiness to it. So it probably smelled like a grandma's, like Yardley of London or White Diamond. So it smelled kind of dated. She would eventually had more financial burdens in the 1940s because she didn't want to update. It would close in 1948, and many people would tout like, "See, this is what happens when you let a woman run a store." But the newspapers commented on the amount of silver-haired shoppers who came during the closing days. Some of them are linked in arms, reminiscing about the store where they bought so much stuff from, the store that employed them. Like, I can see millennials being like this, like in 20 years when Target finally goes under, because they keep shooting themselves in the foot. And many people would think like Molly's story is a failure. But Molly dominated in a field where men were supposed to only dominate. Molly was a woman that did not have this education that many men had. The women who made waves during Victorian society were women that had good pedigrees. They were parents whose parents were very wealthy, who were broad-minded enough, who realized not only did their sons need education, but their women or their daughters needed it as well. So their daughters had tutors, they went to day schools, they went to boarding schools, they went to quaint college towns in New England, and they learned philosophy, French, and art. People like Molly were never supposed to succeed. They were tenement people. At most, they were just supposed to survive. But she did make waves. She made, out of all the people on State Street, this woman made Marshall Field shake in his boots because this man loved his store so much and how prideful he was with it that a woman could possibly surpass his store. So for that, I will always toast to Molly because out of everyone on State Street, she's probably the baddest bitch there was. Not all love on State Street, though, happened in department stores. Some of it happened in hotels. And we're not talking about scandalous like Afternoon Delights. We're talking about the Grand Dame of State Street, the house that's associated with the brownie that was never invented by the woman that credited for inventing the brownie. The building that eventually would house a child bride. I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. Potter Palmer and Bertha Palmer, Chicago's first power couple. And Bertha is something I really like talking about because we have something in common. If you guess that I'm very, very wealthy, that's it. I'm just doing this for charity. I'm not getting paid at all for this. That's a dead lie. Bertha and I share one thing. We are both Catholic school kids. Do we have anybody who went to Catholic school? See, we got a couple. People, my friends who did not go to Catholic school, like, you Catholic school kids are so damn cliquish. And it's true, if I find somebody who went to a Catholic school in Chicago, I automatically like them better. I think it's because we have like shared trauma. Like you probably have like lower back and knee pain because you witnessed a Catholic mass. If I had to go to Stations of the Cross now as an adult, I would require physical therapy. And Catholics know what I'm talking about. But she was a good Catholic schoolgirl who's not even from Chicago. She hails from Louisville, Kentucky. She came here. Let me pull my notes. In 1855, at the age of 6, she grew up on the west side of Chicago in the Union Park area in the Kentucky colony, where you had wealthy Kentuckians building mansions. Her father was very wealthy, involved in business. And despite them being so wealthy, they would not have been welcomed on streets like Prairie Avenue because like many people, or French people at the time, the honorees were Catholic. In the American South and Southwest, you had wealthy Catholics because they were descended from the French and Spanish settlers. But in the Midwest and New England, if you run into a Catholic, they were probably poor. They were your Irish, your Polish, your Italian, your Southern German, your various Slavic nations, this whole cornucopia and potpourri of poverty. But when you ran into a wealthy Catholic in Chicago, it was like, oh, it's odd. It's like, you know what, they're strange people. Like their services are in a dead language. They got all that smoke and incense. They have like that Mary in the bathtub on their front lawn. Like, I don't know what the hell's going on. I don't want them living with me. So Bertha in her youth would have been snubbed by a lot of Prairie School society because of her religion. Potter was kind of a religious anomaly as well. He was a Quaker, like oatmeal fame. And he met Bertha at the ripe age of 13. And it's like, when this girl's of age, I'm going to marry her. And he was 36. Financially, he had a lot to offer. He was very wealthy. He was in law. He ran the very famous department store of Potter Palmer and Company, which would eventually become Marshall Field and Company. He was involved in real estate. He is the reason why State Street exists today. If it wasn't for him, Frank Sinatra would have been singing about Lake Street, that great street. He encouraged State Street development. Eventually, he would end up snagging Bertha in 1870. She was 21, he was 44. Many would consider her a child bride, but what would really raise more eyebrows, it was Potter's first marriage. So if in the Victorian era, if you were a middle-class person, you probably took one photo in your life. It was your wedding photo. You would have like a 20-year-old next to a 17-year-old. And hop forward 20 years, now that man's 40 and his wife is 23. Is she lying about her age like I am? I know I'm not 27. I'm 29 now. Many Victorian men knew when they got married when they were younger, that wife you may have when you're 20 probably won't be around when you're older. Childbirth would kill many women. Just existing in the Victorian time was pretty deadly. So it's basically like your starter wife. So you wouldn't marry again because you need somebody to maintain your household. At this point of life, you should be more established. You should have a homestead or a business. So she's getting financial stability. It's a win-win for everyone. But this is his first marriage. Like, Potter, you're really marrying this child. But oddly enough, out of everyone we're going to talk to about today, their marriage was probably the most secure. Probably because Potter liked to believe the philosophy of happy wife, happy life. Happy wife, happy life. He adored this woman. And when you really love something, you can give them whatever they want. So she not only had carte blanche to his bank accounts, she had immense amount of freedom to say what she wanted to say, which was a rarity in Victorian era. If you were a Victorian woman, your opinion was your husband's opinion, if he even gave you that. You're just supposed to parrot him. To prove his love for her, I know when many of my friends got married, they were excited to get a KitchenAid. She got the Palmer House Hotel as a wedding gift. So my friends clearly were cheered out when they got that KitchenAid. She got to enjoy that hotel for a whopping 13 days. It burned during the Great Chicago Fire. But their marriage was very good. It brought two children, two sons, Honoré and Potter. And him being the famous developer, he ended up moving to the north side of Chicago on Lakeshore Drive when all of Chicago was very old money. We're still living on Prairie Avenue, Calumet. He's like, you know what? We were snubbed there at one time. We're living on the north side. And eventually, Prairie Avenue wouldn't exist anymore. They would gravitate up north on the fancy north side. And she would eventually become Queen of Chicago society. Pretty impressive for a Catholic girl that was kind of snubbed in the beginning. She did, besides being the Queen of Chicago society, she had a soft spot for women. Because the majority of women that were living in Chicago's crowded tenements, they would basically be her. They were poor and Catholic. If she did not have money, that could easily be her. So she was deeply involved in investing in kindergartens for working mothers, that working mothers have good working conditions. She teamed up with Jane Addams to do a garment workers strike. She would host these strike workers in her mansion in the house. People that would have never been in a house this large, treated as guests of Bertha Palmer, because she really did have a soft spot for women. This would include, especially during 1894 when we had the Pullman strike in Chicago. Before the Pullman strike, the Pullmans and the Palmers were like this. They were very close. So it probably really shocked George Pullman when Bertha's like, you know, George, that's really not right what you're doing to these people. You know, you're raising the rents, you're raising the prices of stuff in the company store. And, you know, those men, of course, are having to work at lower wages, but it's these poor women that are at home dealing with crying children because they're hungry, or these poor housewives like, how am I going to stretch this little amount of money? I can't feed my family anymore. So she sided with the workers. Needless to say, when the Pullman strike ended, so did their friendship. But she didn't care. The Queen of Chicago Society had spoke. She spoke her mind. When the Columbian Exposition came to Chicago, it was only natural. The hostess of Chicago should be the de facto hostess of the World's Fair. She was also nominated to the board of lady managers. We'll talk about them later. They basically were like an HOA. They were pretty insufferable. But as a hostess at Chicago, she would host foreign dignitaries, bigwigs from across the country. She hosted a Spanish princess in her mansion on Lakeshore Drive. And if you get invited to a dinner party, you may ask, like, what are we having? What could I bring? If you're very persnickety, is it kosher? Is it nut-free? Is it vegan? But the Spanish princess, the Infanta, asked a very important question. She asked it very loudly, and she asked it in English. Why are we dining with innkeepers? So of course it would be like, of course a Spanish princess is going to say it's a princess. Well, this is a princess who hated monarchy. She was educated in France because Spain was not politically at the right time to host a monarchy. And she was educated, and she's like, I get selected to go to America to represent Spain during the World's Fair. America, the land of equality, and where women are making all these leaps and bounds. And she realizes Americans are even more insufferable than European monarchs because Europe has monarchs. We don't have nobility here. Ours are self-made. This is the Victorian era where people were going to Europe, these wealthy industrialists. They would go to palaces and castles, monasteries and abbeys, walk into a room and like, this is beautiful. I'll take it. And by lock, stock, and barrel, now you have instant ancestors from off the wall. When your ancestors like were hard scrabble in Massachusetts and farming. So she found this incredibly insufferable, ostentatious, and it really boiled down like this is basically what Bertha Palmer is. So she threw some major shade. So thank goodness that Bertha dressed conservatively. She was not wearing a tea gown. She was wearing a very fitted dress because that clearly would have busted a tit. But she handled the thing very graciously, like she didn't hear it. Later on, the Infanta would write in her autobiography, I probably shouldn't have said that. She was a very good host. When Bertha Palmer was later on the European continent and the Infanta was getting married and she was clearly invited to the wedding, she's like, oh no, I refuse to go see that representative, that drunk representative of that degenerate monarchy. So she would eventually get her comeuppance. So when Bertha was in charge of the board of lady managers for the World's Fair, she had all these bright ideas. Almost all of them were shot down. These women were very prudish Victorian women. They did not want alcohol at the fair. They did not want uncultured art, ethnic dance. It should be wholesome and uplifting. And the men in charge like, okay, we'll take that in consideration. They did nothing. And many people would think like, Bertha's a prude. I mean, she can't help it. She went to Catholic school. If you went to Catholic school, you either come out a sinner or a saint. There is no in between. I'll let you guess what I am. And I used to think that too. I'm like, she can't help it. She's a prude. She's from wealth. But during her, she loved to collect art, and she would make friends with artists. And they actually respected her because she, in school, learned about art. And she wasn't just a meal ticket. It's like someone I can talk to. She would make friends with somebody named Mary Cassatt, a very impressionist painter. Mary would later say, it must be Bertha's French blood that makes her want to be someone, not something. Those half-naked gyrating women on the Midway Plaisance, those naked statues of women, those naked paintings of women are doing nothing to uplift women. They're just eye candy for men, Victorian men that are very sexually starved. And she wanted to showcase women can almost do anything men can do. The Women's Pavilion at the World's Fair was designed by a woman. Women can be artists. They can be philosophers. They can do everything as men. So you view them as just like, oh yeah, you're an architect, but you got a pair of knockers. It's like you're weakening the cause. So if she may be a prude, she may not be. I'll leave it up to you. I don't think she really was. I think she really was trying to progress women as much as she could. In 1904, years after the fair ended, Potter Palmer died. She got left $8 million. That's about $288 million today. And this is the point where people are like, she is going to piss through that money. Because women can't do math, especially Catholic school kids. They can't do math at all. In 16 years, she doubled that money. She got heavily invested in Florida, the Sunshine State. I don't know why anybody would want to go down there, but apparently she did. She was one of the first socialites to go down there when Florida was basically a swamp. She would eventually own 1/3 of Sarasota County. She realized this land is valuable because you can grow citrus here. You can grow cattle here. You can develop this land. So a woman who is known for wearing tiaras was now wearing the hat of a rancher. She would still continue to travel abroad extensively because she loved her art collection. She would constantly return home to Chicago, though. Chicago was her home. She would return to the mansion that Palmer built on Lakeshore Drive. In 1918, she returned home for good. She passed away from breast cancer. And she is buried next to Potter Palmer. And this is probably like my favorite quote of, oh, this is a fair. See, I missed one. My favorite quote of Bertha, even more important than the discovery of Columbus, which we are gathering together to celebrate, is the fact that the general government has just discovered women. So Southern Belle really did Chicago proud. Many women in Chicago have tried to be the hostess of Chicago, but none could really hold a candle to Bertha Palmer. Now we get to talk about scandalous stuff now. So we've been talking about high-end society, but there was also a seedy part of State Street. So when you go to south of Van Buren, you trade high-end shops for State Street WAP. And it's always been like this for much of Chicago history. But why, though? It was so close to the original red light district. The train station was right there at Polk Station, and it was surrounded by brothels and bars and houses of ill repute. And we can look at it like a fun way, like, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun, like a Steinbeck novel, but it's like they were advising women not to get off at nighttime there. Do not go unescorted there because you can easily get sex trafficked. And this was much of an annoyance to very Victorian Chicago because we wanted to give this image of order. We're a city built on a grid. We're this gleaming metropolis. Eventually, we're going to be the biggest city in the country. And this was an eyesore. Siegel Cooper and Company opened up in 1887 in the second Leader building. Still stands today as Robert Morris College. This is a very high-end department store, early contender against Marshall Field's. And clearly this would gentrify the area, having this elegant department store. Marshall Field was known for Meet Me Under the Clock. Siegel Cooper and Company had a ginormous fountain in the lobby, Meet Me at the Fountain. They sold everything from silk to high-end blouses to anything a woman could want, because department stores were basically the domain of women. So when these elegantly clad women left the store and they looked just to the south, they saw drunken men and prostitutes and cheap hotels and greasy spoons and dime museums, and they would be clutching their pearls. A high-end store clearly could not turn things around. They lasted until about 1930. And then All-American Superpower store opened up. Many people still remember the store, and it's still hanging on today. Sears Roebuck and Company, now featuring Grandma with babushkas. And clearly this, with the amount of foot traffic, because when Sears opened on opening day, they had 30,000 people. That was more than like the population of Evanston coming on this one day. This was the second biggest company in the United States after Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. This was a big deal. Did it change the area? No. So when you had these very cost-conscious middle-class women step out, now the buildings are even older and more decrepit, and there's still the prostitutes and drunken people, so they would clutch like plastic pearls. It was not getting better. In the 1920s, State Street did a glow up. We got new lighting on State Street. The State Street lights you see today are reproductions of the ones we originally had. It made State Street the brightest street on the planet. It could still not put light on the shadows that was South State Street. It was still all sex, sex, sex. It was peep shows. It was dime museums. Dime museums, if you don't know what they are, they're like variety shows. You can watch like a 6-foot-tall woman. How amazing is that? You can see people swallowing swords. You can see little people juggling. You can see a dancing skeleton. You can see a mermaid. It was all crap, but it was very lowbrow fun. And it survived so long because it was making money. The area was dominated by cheap hotels, and these were places where people who worked in lower-end jobs on State Street would work. People behind the scenes. They were not your shop girl. They were like behind the scenes because they're fugly. So you wanted to keep them out of sight. But they were essential, and they needed stuff that they would go to, like greasy spoons and places to buy adult films and things like that. And this existed till about the 1990s when we finally started revamping State Street. Like, this has to go. When everyone's favorite thing, Harold Washington Library was built. Now it's Naperville approved. It's nice, clean, and sanitized. We got rid of all the grift. We made it brand new and sanitized. If you want to see kind of the gritty part of State Street, go on Clark Street where Coco's used to be. Rest in peace for the deep fried lobster. You can still see a little bit of the grittiness that was State Street south of Van Buren, but most of it's gone. The city continues to gentrify. Inner city is not even a term anymore because every neighborhood inner city that touches the loop is pretty expensive to live in now. So it's there for your viewing pleasure. Today it's a lot more sanitized. You're not going to find many drunken people or greasy spoons or prostitutes. I guess you can look hard enough, you might find one or two, but it greatly has changed, much to the joy of Chicagoans, which always this has been an eyesore. And for our last topic, we're going to go back in time. Because not all scandal is bad. Some scandal makes you change your mind. Some makes you realize, like, you know what I was reading in the newspaper really isn't what I personally experienced. So put on your thinking caps, and we're going to go back to picture it. State Street, 1903. We're at Hillman's Department Store on the corner of State and Washington. It was a normal business day. The store hasn't opened up yet, but it was going to be incredibly different. You hear the click-clack of a woman's shoes. She's very poised. She's very put together. She's very professional looking. What could be different? This woman is black. Hillman's department store had broken the racial code and hired its first black white-collar worker. State Street is going to have a fit. So Hillman, Edward Hillman, the owner of this department store, he hails from Quebec, Canada. He came to Chicago at the age of 6. And he would have known what it felt like to be a second-class citizen. He was a German Jew. And in Chicago, you had this unique position as a German Jew. Most of them were pretty wealthy. And you had people like the ones living on State Street or on Prairie Avenue. And it's like, can we live here? Of course you can live here as a Jew. We're very broad-minded. We're educated. But you have to live on Prairie Jewish Avenue. It's just a couple blocks away. Can somebody turn that off, please? Thank you. Back to the production. So Jewish people could live on Prairie Avenue, but had to be in their own section. If you were a titan of industry and you were Jewish and say you want to join something like the commercial club, the person in charge of admitting, like, I'd let you in, but, it's restricted. We can't let Jewish people in. But you can join the standard club. It's for you people. It's just as nice. Even when it came to Chicago architecture, a lot of buildings in Chicago have Jewish pedigrees. They had a lot of famous Jewish architects in Chicago. They would design things like athletic clubs, gyms, commercial, like fraternal clubs. They would be designing buildings they would not be ever allowed to go into. So Jewish people and German Jews in Chicago find themselves in an odd position. They were between not being fully accepted by Chicago's economic elites, and newer immigrants didn't like them either. Like, we're all immigrants too. Why are you getting special treatment? So Hillman knew, it's like, you know what? It sucks to be second class. So he hired this woman. Her job was basically to go within departments, just dropping off letters. So you didn't have to interact with her if you were a customer. Since she did so good, Hillman's like, you know what? We should have all the elevator attendants be black. Then the shit hit the fan. So an emergency meeting was called by the State Street Merchant Association. And a lot of small towns, this would have been called the Businessmen Association. But at this meeting in 1902, you had people like Marshall Field, people from Carson Peary Scott, the Mender brothers. But you also had the Jewish princess of State Street, Molly Netcher. And they were all mad. Like, Mr. Hillman, we let you have your fun. We let you hire this black woman. But having these elevator attendants is way too much. You need to let them go. And he's like, I would let them go, but they're doing a fine job. I have no reason to. Mr. Hillman, this is not a discussion. We are telling you they are to be fired. So you've gone too far when you piss a Canadian off. So he didn't suggest it. He didn't imply it. He told some of the most powerful men and women in Chicago, you can go to hell. I am not going to be told what I can do and cannot do in my own store. If I want to hire an all-black staff, I can. It's my store. And he stormed off and left. He eventually would hire 1/3 of his staff being black. And it did not affect the customer experience. The State Street Merchant Association was so concerned because department stores were the domain of women. Women basically went by themselves because their husbands were working in the loop so they can afford to support wives who shopped in department stores. And you would be there for a long time. Sometimes you would have lunch there, and you would go between the floors, and you would read newspaper articles that would say, the blacks that are coming up, they're crude, they're they're horrible to interact with. And you're talking to an elevator attendant, like, it may say that in the newspaper, but I talk to Michael all the time. He's my elevator attendant. He's very nice. He's got 3 kids. One of his daughters is going to school to be a teacher. I don't know why the newspaper is saying that, but I don't think he's like that at all. And I don't think black people are all like that either. So it was an eye-opening experience, but State Street was not having it. Because he welcomed the employment of black workers, he also brought in many black shoppers. The newspapers would talk about how Hillman's opened their door to black employees, and we will gladly give him our money. Hillman would eventually, at the age of 86, he would pass away. He would give $5,000 in their money to Jewish charity, but the majority of his money went to Christian organizations because they're the ones who really made him wealthy. He would donate $10,000 to the YWCA, $1,000 to the YMCA, and even $500 to his barber. So he really thought of everyone in his will. In closing, State Street in Chicago put so much effort in this one street. They want to make it the premier street. Like New York with its massive, messy streets, we are on a perfect grid. We lined State Street with marble and terracotta and this perfect order. We want to make it this perfect street, and it really wasn't. State Street was a street where society's pillars and society's degenerates were mere blocks from each other, many times crossing paths, many times they were one and the same. We wanted to basically eliminate what it was to be human, because we're basically sinners and saints at the same time. State Street would be the great central market where all Chicagoans would come shop and dine and basically get to enjoy what it is to live in a city. State Street was this epicenter for much of Chicago's history, where black, Asian, white, everyone could commingle. We'd like to separate them, but they all melded here in the great central market. And all these factors really didn't make State Street that great street. And thank you very much for listening to my